Hi, everyone. My name is Klein, again with the Department of Psychological Sciences here at Case Western. This is the second part of the two-part video series on shifting your thinking. So in this part of the series, we will focus on strategies to notice and change your thinking. And again, this series is brought to you by the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Wellness and Preventative Care Pathway. And so a little outline or roadmap of where we're going today. We're going to start with just a super brief review of our first video. So reviewing types of unhelpful thinking and patterns of unhelpful thinking. We'll then look at strategies to actually shift thinking. So we'll focus on three different strategies here. We'll then focus on strategies to unhook from a ruminative thinking pattern like we discussed in that previous video. And we'll end with some strategies to target thought suppression. Again, like we discussed in that previous video. So a quick review. In the first part of the series, we discussed a bunch of different types of unhelpful thinking. We also discussed the reciprocal relationship between thoughts, negative mood states, and behavior, and started to understand how our thinking can actually influence negative mood states and vice versa. We talked about that in medical students, specifically imposter syndrome and perfectionism are two common types of unhelpful thinking that tend to arise, and that these things are related to physician burnout, to negative emotions about your performance in school, and even to anxiety and depression symptoms. And then finally, we talked about two different patterns that tend to arise with negative thinking. So on the one hand, folks who tend to ruminate or kind of get stuck in a loop of thinking. And on the other hand of that spectrum, folks who tend to suppress thoughts or really try to actively push them away. So just a little recap on what we reviewed. And again, if you want more detail on any of the above, please feel free to refer back to the first video in this series. In that video, we also started to think about identifying our own thinking patterns and where we might get stuck. And so, like we talked about, the first step to actually shifting unhelpful thinking is to notice that it's going on for you in the first place. And so I asked you some of these questions at the end of that first video. When I feel negative emotions, what thoughts do I tend to have? Do these thoughts fit with any of the unhelpful thinking patterns that we reviewed in that first video? And am I someone that tends to ruminate or perseverate, or do I really try to push thoughts out? The point here is that we're trying to get you to see situations where negative thoughts come up, what kinds of negative thoughts come up, and what you tend to do with those negative thoughts. Do you perseverate on them, or do you tend to push them away? Understanding this stuff about yourself, again, is going to be that first step to actively shifting it. So keep all of this in mind as you watch kind of the rest of this video series. Okay, so now we're going to delve into those three strategies that I mentioned to shift thinking. And before we really delve in, I do want to give a quick caveat here. Changing thinking is really, really hard. All of these approaches take a lot of different practice and take really trying them in your day-to-day life in order for them to be effective. I also want to highlight here that these are general tips and skills for addressing unhelpful thinking. This is not necessarily specific clinical advice for any one person. If you notice that you're someone who's getting really stuck, who's having a hard time using these strategies, if that's getting in the way of your life, if it's making your mood really poor, that might be a good time to seek professional care to address your specific unhelpful thinking concerns. But with all of that being said, let's move to talking about some of those strategies, those more general strategies to shift thinking. So a first one can be to notice and describe unhelpful thoughts from a non-judgmental perspective. And so often thoughts are interpretations of situations that we add on top of facts. They are not facts themselves. And so these interpretations can look like assumptions and judgments, and those things often fuel really difficult emotions. So if we take a situation and we're adding our own interpretation on things, and those interpretations happen to be an unhelpful thought, of course, it's going to make sense that that's going to lead to some kind of negative mood state. And one way to start shifting thoughts is to actually replace judgments with facts. So what does that mean, and what does that look like? Let's imagine a scenario where you've just received a poor grade on a test. And this is a scenario we're going to carry through all the different strategies that we talk about today. Your first thoughts are likely to be automatic ones, and full of interpretations and judgments. So it's possible that you get that test grade back, and the very first thing that comes to your head is, I'm a failure. I'm so dumb. How did I even get into medical school? I don't belong here. And it's important to highlight that although we can't always control those thoughts, those are interpretations and judgments of a situation. Those are not facts of a situation. What this skill is doing is noticing when judgments come up. It's saying, okay, I noticed that I had an unhelpful thought. I noticed that that thought was a judgment and maybe not the reality of the situation. How can I, in turn, say this thought non-judgmentally instead? And so this is actually asking you to rephrase your thoughts by sticking to the facts. A helpful way to think about this can be like as if you were writing a police report, right? So what would the police want to know? What are the facts of the situation? And so here are some alternative interpretations, sticking to the facts instead of adding those interpretations and judgments on top of it. So one might be, I didn't do as well on that test as I wanted to. Another might be, I got a bad grade on that test, right? Those are both facts. And a final one might be, I'm noticing thoughts that I'm a failure. So although the thought that you are a failure is a judgment or an interpretation, noticing that you're having the thought is actually a fact. And so what that also does is it creates some distance with that thought. So I'm noticing that ... can be a really helpful sentence stem for people to use if they're having a hard time kind of rephrasing things as facts. So why does this help? Why does this work? First and foremost, it separates our judgments and assumptions from the facts of a situation. So it pulls those two things apart. In doing so, it helps us create some distance between us and our thoughts. So just like I mentioned with that sentence stem, if you're having a hard time thinking, how can I say something non-judgmentally? Adding that sentence stem, I'm noticing the thought that I'm a failure, can be one really helpful way to create some distance. And doing so doesn't minimize that something bad or frustrating or upsetting occurred. And it also doesn't let our own interpretations exacerbate the situation above and beyond what's actually going on. So it can still feel not great to get the grade on a test that you didn't want to get, and it doesn't mean that you're a failure, right? So this is kind of how that skill works. Another skill that we can use is thinking flexibly about situations. And so thoughts are automatic. We can't control what pops into our head or what doesn't pop into our head. And often in a difficult situation, the first thought can be a negative one. And so it's really easy to just think, to get really stuck on that first thought, to become really rigid about that first thought, and to think that this is the right thought or the right way of viewing things. What we actually know is that there is no one right way. There are multiple ways to see any situation. And so this skill is all about considering multiple perspectives for a given situation above and beyond that initial thought. And so really the question to ask yourself to start thinking flexibly is, what's another way to think about this? Are there other perspectives I could take? How else could I view this situation? So let's go back to our example. Again, imagining a scenario where you've just received a poor test grade. That automatic, very first thought that popped into your head is, I'm a failure, right? And if we're using this skill of thinking flexibly, we're going to ask ourselves, what's another way to think about the situation? And we're going to generate as many alternative perspectives as possible. And so here are a few that I was able to come up with. And I would encourage you, if you have the time and are interested, to maybe pause at this point and think of some for yourself too. And so one other way to think about the situation of getting a poor grade is that test was really hard. Another way is there were some things that I did know on that test and some things that I didn't know on that test. I didn't do well on that test, and I've done well on tests in the past. The test didn't go the way I wanted it to, but I am doing well in other areas of my life. And that really sucked, but it doesn't end my career, or it isn't the end of my career. So you can see here that we're taking that initial thought, I'm a failure, we're pausing, we're slowing down, and we're introducing a lot of other different ways to think about the situation. You also may notice here that none of these thoughts are overly positive or are saying like, I'm the biggest success ever. We're not necessarily taking the opposite of that first thought that comes in. What we're doing is introducing a bunch of other perspectives that might be more realistic, than that initial thought, which is likely going to be a judgment of ourselves. And so why does this help? Well, it introduces a lot of different ways of thinking about a situation and shows us that maybe the first way we thought about it isn't the most accurate or the most rooted in reality. It's also true that even if you do this and maybe you don't totally buy those other thoughts, maybe that thought, I'm a failure, is still really sticking around. What it does is it at least helps you to see that there are other perspectives on the situation, which may reduce the intensity of the initial thought, even if it doesn't totally get rid of it. And doing this helps you get unstuck from rigid thinking patterns and gets you starting to think more flexibly about things in general. Our final kind of strategy for shifting thinking is going to be challenging thoughts and generating alternative thoughts. So we're kind of, a lot of these skills have some overlap. We're kind of combining things, but there are multiple different ways to kind of get to the same endpoint. And so similar to our thinking flexibly skill, this skill is all about generating new ways of thinking about a situation, and at the same time helps us test the validity of our thinking in the first place. So what this skill involves is asking ourselves a bunch of questions to kind of check in with the validity or accuracy of our very first thought. And so these might be, what evidence do I have to support the thought? What is some evidence that I have against that thought? What would I say to a friend in a similar situation? Will this event matter in 1 year, in 5 years, in 1 hour, in 1 week? What's the worst case scenario if this thought is true? Even if the worst case scenario does come true, can I cope with that? And is there a more realistic thought about the situation that I can come up with? And so let's take our same example here, imagining again that you're in a scenario where you've just received a poor test grade. And what we're going to do, well, our automatic thought again is, I'm a failure. So that's the very first thought that kind of pops up. And what we're going to do is we're going to challenge that first automatic thought, I'm a failure, by asking all of those questions that were just on the first slide right before this. And so first and foremost, what evidence do I actually have supporting the thought that I'm a failure? Well, I didn't do well on that test, right? That would support that thought. What's some evidence that I have against that thought? I did well on other exams and assignments that week. I can't be a failure across the board. The teacher whose class it was where I got that poor test grade has complimented my work in the past. It's likely that it's just this one test. What would you say to a friend in a similar situation? That really sucks. I'm sure you tried your best. 1 grade means nothing about your capability, or some other thing that you would say to comforting a friend. The goal with this is that a lot of times we're much harder on ourselves than we are on other people. And so thinking about flipping the script to say it to someone else can often be a really helpful strategy. Will this event matter in 1 year, in 5 years? Probably not, right? Probably by the time that you're on residency or in your career as an attending, it's unlikely that you'll even be thinking about that test. What's the worst case scenario? That you fail the class, right? If you fail a test, maybe you're not going to do well in that class. And even if the worst is true, can I cope with it? It would be really hard to cope with failing a class. It would suck. And you could survive it. There's a way through it. And so even if something's really hard, can you cope with it and can you live? Yes. And finally, taking all of this stuff, so we've just done a bunch to challenge our initial thought of I'm a failure. Can I think of an alternative thought to replace that original thought? And so is there a more realistic thought about the situation? It really sucks that I didn't do well on that test, but it doesn't mean that I'm a complete failure. And so again, that's kind of taking skills from our other two to generate alternative perspectives, and to also kind of stick to the facts of situations and reduce judgment on ourselves. And so why does this help? Why does it help to challenge our thoughts and to generate those alternative thoughts? It causes you to challenge the validity of thoughts and to examine whether the event is in fact as catastrophic as it feels. It also helps you realize that you can cope with hard situations, even if they bring on a lot of really painful emotions, you can handle them. And it gives you an alternative way to view the situation. And so those are 3 different strategies to help us focus on shifting our thinking. Now we're going to move into some strategies for helping us unhook from ruminative thinking, which again is that kind of that cycle where we tend to loop or get stuck on a specific line of thinking. And so remember, like I just said, that ruminative thinking is all about getting stuck on a loop of unhelpful thoughts. And often we think that if we just think about it enough, if we just spend enough time thinking, we'll come to some kind of conclusion or solution. And actually, this functions as avoidance because it really interferes with our approach-oriented behavior and problem solving. So rather than actually solving the problem, all we've done is think about solving the problem. And so it's really, really hard to say, just stop thinking, just stop ruminating, just unhinge and get out of there. And so one thing that we can do to break the cycle is to do the opposite of what rumination wants you to do. Rumination wants you to think and think and think and not do and do and do. So one actually very concrete way to break the cycle of rumination is to get active, go on a walk, take a stretch, call a friend, in some way get activated, right? Break the cycle by doing something. Another thing is to actually approach the problems that you're facing, even if it's a really small step. So even if you haven't been able to think through that solution, try to unhinge or unhook from rumination by taking a really small step to actually solving the problem. Another thing that's not on this slide that some people find helpful is actually setting aside a concrete 15 or 30 minutes of something called worry time, where they can just kind of go wild with rumination. And then once that time's over with, they actually then have to shift to getting activated or approaching problem solving. And again, I'd encourage you to kind of see what works for you. The goal here is doing the opposite of what rumination wants you to do, to get active, to start to solve those problems, and to take some steps for actually doing and approaching things. And so finally, we're going to talk about some strategies to target thought suppression. And we know that for some, when unhelpful thoughts come up, they do everything they can to avoid them. They push them out, they distract, they actively try to not think about those things. And what that does is it causes those thoughts to pop up even stronger. And so in the first video, we talked about that this can be like if you're pushing a beach ball down, that's like suppressing thoughts. You're pushing it down there, you're holding it down, you're trying to shove it away. The second you lift your hands up, those thoughts are going to come back. If you don't believe me, I encourage you to pause this video for 30 seconds to a minute and do absolutely everything you can not to think about or picture a white bear dancing around. Actively try to push away that thought. And why didn't that work if you gave that a try? Well, part of it is that in actively trying to suppress something, you're actually thinking about it, right? If you're actively trying to push something out, you're thinking about trying to push it out. Also, we know that just because maybe you can shove away painful emotions or thoughts, that doesn't make them go away, and the problem is often still there. So once you do push that thing away, it's likely to just come back up again anyway. So what can we do to get around thought suppression? Similarly with rumination, we're asking you to do the opposite. We're asking you to invite those thoughts in, to welcome them home for dinner, and to sit with them for a little bit. And so why might that work? So we know that thoughts and emotions are all temporary. Emotions actually only last chemically in our brain for 7 to 21 seconds. And it's our thinking and our behavior that actually prolong them and kind of keep that vicious cycle going. And so if we just sit with an emotion, we'll notice that it will naturally fluctuate over time. It might come down, it might come back up, it might come way down, it might only come a little bit down. Regardless, it's going to be moving in some way. And so what we're asking you to do instead of trying to push that thought or emotion out is to sit with it temporarily and to kind of ride the wave of it and notice that it is changing and is moving. Once you've done that, it might be helpful to then try some of those other strategies to kind of shift thinking that we discussed before. But this is similarly with rumination, we're actually doing the opposite here of pushing out. We're going to welcome thoughts in. And so I want to end by just giving a quick summary of everything that we've just discussed and kind of talking through some concrete steps that you can take for shifting your thinking. And so step one is to notice unhelpful thoughts that come up for you and situations where they tend to come up. Step 2 is to then use some of those shifting skills to try to describe the thought in non-judgmental language, to think about it from alternative perspectives, or to test the validity of the thought. A third step is to notice if you're getting stuck on the thought or if you're actively trying to push it away. And a final step, if either of those are the case, is to try to get active and problem solve or welcome in the thought and emotion and notice it changing. An important note that I've made at the bottom is that it doesn't always go in these steps, right? Sometimes rumination is the problem. Sometimes thought suppression is the problem. Sometimes for us, it's one particular thought or one particular unhelpful type of thinking. It might not always go in this order, and that's okay. The important thing here is to notice what's coming up for you, implement some strategies, notice what's changing, and repeat steps as needed. And remember that shifting your thinking takes a lot of practice. It's super hard, and it's something that you need to try kind of over and over again with a lot of repeated effort to see occur naturally in your day-to-day life. And so it will feel a bit unnatural at first to use some of these strategies, and the more that you use them, the more that's you living life differently and trying to make changes. And thank you all so much for tuning in to both parts of our series on shifting thinking. And of course, if anyone has any questions, you can always contact me at any point. And here are those references again. Thank you all so much.